Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Knife Chats with Tobias. This episode is a response to an open tag that was started by Paddy's Potato Peelers. And it was 6 knives that will never leave your channel. And one of the things he mentioned at the beginning of that channel was basically knives that show up on the channel frequently, basically as a comparison knife for other videos. So it's a knife that you break out to compare to new knives that you're showing on your channel. And that's not something I normally do, but I thought I would still take a shot at answering Paddy's open tag. Now, I think part of the reason I don't normally do the comparisons that he's talking about is because, well, it seems like something that is done on channels where they're featuring modern folders quite often. And I don't do a lot of modern folders. But I do frequent channels that do quite a few reviews of modern folders. And there's basically 3 knives that show up all the time on those channels as a comparison knife. Actually, there's about 4 of them that show up all the time. And I do not own any of those 4 knives. The 4 knives you often will see is the Benchmade Bug Out, the Benchmade 940, the Spyderco Paramilitary 2, and the Spyderco Delica. And these knives are often pulled out and used to show a size comparison with other modern folders. And I think it is very helpful for people to do that. But what I tend to do instead is I use my honest, dishonest fisherman knife. And I just measure the knife on the channel, and that's what I typically do when I'm talking about the size of the knife. I give you the size of the knife using a ruler. I have in the past used a couple knives for comparison, but I tend not to do that. And maybe it's something I should be doing, at least in my slideshow. Maybe it would be a good way to give people an idea and to have a knife or two for comparisons for traditional knives. Now, believe it or not, I've actually put some thought into this, and I've thought about it in the past too, but I've just never really pulled the trigger on doing this. But maybe it is time for me to do that. And so what I'm going to show you are 6 knives that I think would be helpful to show as comparison knives for other traditional knives, and why I've chosen these 6 knives. And before I start showing the 6 knives, I'm going to basically tell you the reason I've chosen these 6 knives is because I think these are knives that everyone is familiar with to a degree. Many people have either owned them at one time or another, or they have something that is very similar to them in their collection already, or it is a knife that they have seen so often that they are very familiar with it, even if they've never even bought it. And that's why these 6 knives are in my thoughts on 6 knives that I should keep in my collection, specifically just so I can compare it to other traditional pattern knives so a person would know about how big that other knife is. So let's get started. Now, my first thought is I need both big and little knives because there's a wide variety of sizes in traditional pattern knives. And so I figured I need something for the smaller pattern knives, so the smaller mediums and then the small patterns in general, and then something for the medium and large pattern knives. And this is what I have selected. One of these might change out though. Now I'm going to go straight for the 600-pound gorilla in the room and show this knife, which is, as everyone can tell, one of those gas station knives. It's basically 5 inches long, or close to 5 inches long. Let's break out the ruler here. Yeah, it's a 5-inch long gas station knife. often sold as an SAR or search and rescue knife because it's got the so-called seatbelt cutter in the back. It's got the windshield breaker here, or skull crusher, and then it's your basic flipper knife with a double thumb stud so you can open it either way, and it's got a liner lock. This one has anodized aluminum handles, says Army on the blade. Your basic SAR knife. Now, these knives go for like $6-7. It's not like something that everyone needs to have in their collection. But if you've ever gone to a flea market, if you've ever stopped at numerous gas stations or truck stops or something, you've seen these knives. And my bet is just about everyone has had one of these knives in their collection at one time or another. I know a lot of people will never admit to it, but I got a feeling everyone at one time or another has picked up a gas station search and rescue knife, so they're very familiar with the knife and they know how big it is. And if you want to compare a knife to it, like this Barlow, well, you see there. All right, that's how big the Barlow is. That's how big the gas station knife is. So that's why I think I want this knife in my 6 knives that I can use for comparison, simply because it is so common and everyone is aware of it. Not everyone is aware of the size of a paramilitary 2, which is basically about the same size as this knife, but a much better quality knife. There I go, nicking my blade. Anyway, so that's one of them. It's just simply because they're so common. They're common as dirt. Everyone has run across one at one time or another, so everyone knows what the search and rescue knives are, even if they don't want to admit it. They would know how big that knife is, and when you compare it to another knife, they get it. But let's say you're not coming from the modern folder world. Maybe you've always been stuck in the traditional world and have never even thought about that. Well, then you probably are very aware of the Buck 110, which I have said many a times is the basis for just about every modern folder out there. This is the Buck 110, the large folding hunter, which comes in, again, right at what? 4 7/8 of an inch long, and it's got that 3 3/4 inch blade. So when you break out the Buck 110, people know what it is. Or if you just say 5-inch lockback and you're showing off a different 5-inch lockback, they'll know what you're talking about when you say, all right, I got a 5-inch lockback here. This is the way this knife compares to it. So we see here the Great Eastern Beavertail Coke bottle. We see when you compare it to a 5-inch lockback, it's about the same length and everything. You see there? Pretty much the same size knife. It's a big knife, and you can tell that. And then when you open up the blades, you can see the difference in the blades. So a Buck 110 would be a good knife for use with larger pattern knives. However, maybe that isn't what you need to do. You could have done the same thing with the search and rescue. But let's say, let's look at another knife that I think would work just as well for that. And it also covers the gambit of most medium-sized knives. And while it's not my favorite, it is one of the best-selling folding knives out there, or traditional pattern knives out there, and that is the 4 1/8 inch standard trapper, sometimes also referred to as a premier trapper by the folks at Cutlery Corner Networks. And this is a 4 1/8 inches long, and it's got a 3.5 inch or 3 1/4 inch blade on there, or something like that. 3 1/4 inch clip blade, and also a 3 1/4 inch spay blade. And anyone into traditional pattern knives has run across trappers, and probably owns one or two, even if it's not a pattern that they want to collect. Now, if I were to use that knife and compare the Coke bottle by Great Eastern to it, you can kind of get an idea of how big it is. You can see that the Coke bottle is much larger than that. And you can see the Barlow here by Colonel Kuhn is smaller than that. And the same thing with the Canoe. A canoe would be a good choice too for many people if they did not have a trapper, because most canoes come in at 3 and 5/8 inches long. It's a very standard sized knife. Yes, there are larger ones and stuff, but if you were to say a standard canoe, people would know 3 and 5/8 inches. It's a canoe. 4 1/8 inches long for a standard trapper, people would understand that. And the same thing with a 5-inch lockback, they know it's basically 5 inches. So those knives could work. I would not go with the canoe so much simply because the trapper is so much better known. And I've got another knife that I could use in place of the canoe. Now, worldwide, this knife is known just about everywhere, and that is this is the Victorinox Huntsman, a 4-layer Victorinox knife. It's the one that has the, you got your main blade, you got your spear blade, you got a pair of scissors. Where's the scissors? You got scissors on it, and you have a saw, the saw blade, and then also you have the can opener and the cap lifter and the back tools. The back tools being the punch or awl and the corkscrew. Now the Fieldmaster is the same thing. This is a 91 millimeter knife, so it comes in right at 3 and 5/8 inches long, something like that. Yeah, 3.5 inches long. So if someone were to show this knife just about anywhere in the world, you know it's 91 millimeters, you know it's 3.5 inches long. So it's a great knife to compare in size for a variety of knives simply because you know how big it is. So compare the Barlow to it. You see the Barlow, you see the canoe, and you see the trapper. You can see how this knife would work pretty well for a comparison knife also. And this is one that I would definitely keep in there, especially when you start looking at knives from other countries, or if you're looking at an international audience, because more people are going to be familiar with the 91 millimeter Victorinox knives than even the trapper. And so they'll have an idea when you show this knife, they'll say, oh, now I know how big this knife is compared to the Victorinox. So that would be a good knife to use also. And that brings us to the small knives, because when you break out this and you're trying to show it next to a small knife, well, you can see the small knife is much smaller, but you can't really tell just how much smaller, so you need a different ruler for it. And that's where I think the classic SD comes in handy, because these two knives are known around the world. This is probably the best-selling knife in the world. Everyone is familiar with the 58 millimeter, 2 1/4 inch long classic SD with the clip blade, nail file, and scissors, and then also the tweezers, and also a toothpick. Everyone knows these knives. And so this would be a great knife for comparison for medium and small knives. For instance, here's the 3 1/4 inch lady leg compared to the classic SD. You can see how much bigger it is. This was the the tadpole with a variety of nicknames attached to it. The Rough Rider tadpole. You can see how much smaller it is compared to the classic SD. However, you can also see how much larger or wider the blade is, how much more belly it has, and that the cutting edge is about the same. So you have a better, more substantial blade on there, but it lacks a file and it lacks scissors. So, but you can see the difference between those two knives. So even when comparing small modern folders, the classic SD could come in handy. Novelty knives, there's all sorts of brass novelty knives out there. Well, this gives you an idea of just what the 2 3/4 inch long knife would be. See, there you have it. When you see it like this, it's like, hey, that looks kind of big. When you see it like this, you kind of have an idea of just how big it is. And then you can also see the blade compared to the other blade. So that's why I think this knife comes in handy. But also, I also have a toss-up of two other small traditional pattern knives that you could also throw into the mix if you wanted to. Instead of the classic SD, you could also go with the tiny toothpick, the 3-inch toothpick, and its blade, because this is probably the most collected traditional pattern outside of Victorinox. This is probably the most collected traditional pattern, small pattern knife out there. The second one being probably the Peanut. If someone is collecting traditional patterns, small traditional patterns, they most likely have Peanuts or toothpicks in the collection. So those would be other knives that you could use for a comparison in the small world. And finally, the knife that I haven't shown yet is right here. Now this is by Baron Son, but it is basically the same as the Schrade 152 old timer sharp finger. Knife is the same size and everything else, and I think this knife would be a good knife for comparison's sake when people want to look at a folding knife and determine how does it compare to a fixed blade, because this is a fixed blade, a smaller fixed blade that everyone is familiar with. It's basically 7¼ inches long, and it has that blade that comes in right under 3½ inches long with a cutting edge of 3 inches. And so a lot of people are very familiar with this knife. It's been around for quite some time. It's very iconic, the sharp finger pattern. And, you know, it's one of those knives that I think a lot of people look at and go, you know, they have this knife and they'll think, well, how does this compare to, this is a folding hunter. How does it compare to a fixed blade hunter? And, well, you can actually open these up and see the difference. And you could do the weight differences and everything else and determine, well, why would I want something that weighs twice as much when I could use this in a sheath? So, you know, it's things like that. So that's where I'm at with the comparison knives that I have. And I said I might be changing one out. If I were going to change any of them out, it might just be the Buck 110. And the reason being that, while I think the Buck 110 is probably the best-selling traditional pattern knife out there, the Trapper is more widely known because of Case and so many other companies making trappers, and it's probably very well collected and everything. And the Trapper can do basically the same thing that the Buck 110 can do when it comes to comparing it to other size knives. I mean, you saw it here. I could use this knife to compare it and you'll get a good idea of how large it is. Or I could use the Buck 110 and you see it's about the same size. But when you start comparing the Buck 110 to the Canoe, maybe it starts losing it a little bit. You're not sure. But with the Trapper, I don't know. I just get a better feel for how large the Canoe is when I look at it next to a Trapper. Because this is your, basically, you know, it's 4 1/8 inches. It's basically 4 inches long. And I would just keep this one in here simply because so many people are very familiar with these very inexpensive search and rescue knives. They know exactly how big they are. They've probably had it in their hand at one time or another. And so when they look at this knife and you say, okay, this is how big a Canoe is to it. They go, oh yeah, all right, I know how big that chunky thing is. And they'll get a good idea for it. And, you know, if you have these two knives showing them up, everyone in the modern folder world and everyone in the traditional pattern world will have a good idea or a good index for how big the other knives are. So it's those two. This one's simply for comparing folders to fixed blades, and these for anyone who's dealing with international knives. So, and what was the other one I had? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, and the other knife I'd probably throw in there also, if I were to pull out the Buck 110, would probably be the tiny toothpick, because it is so common among traditional pattern collectors who collect small knives. So there you have it. There's my 6 patterns that I would use for comparison if I wasn't using a ruler instead. And maybe you'll see those knives show up in future videos during the slideshows, if I feel they are important enough at that point for that particular knife. Let me take just a second to thank you once again for dropping by and spending a few minutes here at Knife Chats with the Pious. I really do appreciate it, and I do appreciate any comments that you leave. So please remember to give me that thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode is up and running. Thanks again for dropping by. Really do appreciate your time here.